So this is part 2 of the encoding notes. We're looking back at the serial position effect. So we talked about how serial position effect shows how you are most likely to remember the first and the last items in a list, and these are just a little bit more specific. So first you have the recency effect. Think of things that are most recent, which means you're more likely to remember the last items in a list. The next is the primacy effect here, where after a delay, you're more likely to remember the first items in the list after the last items in the list. And finally, we have the von Restorff effect, and that means if you have an item in your list that maybe has some sort of distinguishing characteristic, you might be more likely to remember it. So for example, if you were trying to recall all of the presidents of the United States, according to recency effect, you're more likely to remember the last presidents. The primacy effect, you're more likely to remember the first, like George Washington. And von Restorff effect means if there were some other presidents that stood out to you for numerous reasons, even if they're in the middle of the list, you would be more likely to remember them. So what we encode levels of processing, and I talked about this a little bit in class after we did our activity the other day. So first we have visual encoding. So visual encoding here is just looking at something. So the encoding of picture images. Here. That's if you're just looking at it. Like if you're looking at your note cards, you're not really doing anything with them, but just looking at them. You can see here about how often you would remember just using visual encoding. Next is acoustic encoding. For example, if there's something that stands out about the words or the sounds, if they rhyme, if there's some saying that sticks out in your mind. This is from the O.J. Simpson trial. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And last is here, and that's semantic encoding, meaning looking at the meaning of words. If you can describe it in your own words or think of it in a different way. I think I said in class, one of the examples for the activity we did was something about a chef, and if you instead remember that as cook, that's semantic encoding. And really the best way and to ensure that you encode the most information is to use multiple levels of encoding, not just focusing on one. So there's going to be some different ways that you can visually encode. One of them is imagery and looking at mental pictures. So this is especially powerful when we pair it with either semantic encoding and acoustic encoding. So if you think about those of you that were in the group where I asked you just to remember the pronunciation of the phrases, a lot of you probably didn't take advantage of imagery as well, which meant you weren't able to remember as many of the questions as those people that both heard the terms and had a mental picture in their head. It's more easy for us to remember concrete nouns, things like a tiger or the long-haired woman or the small child under the lilac bush. If you can get a mental picture of them, the more likely it is that you'll remember. And as I said in class, kind of the more out there the mental picture that you have, again, the better encoded that information will be. Another word that you've heard me use a few times now is mnemonics. And hopefully throughout the course, throughout your time in AP Psych and in your other classes, you'll learn how useful having good mnemonics can be as you're trying to learn and remember new information. So these are memory techniques that use things like imagery and organizational devices to recall information. So one type of mnemonic is known as the peg words, and you'll see 1 through 10 listed here for you. These peg words never change. So we always say 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, 4 is a door, 5 is a hive, 6 is sticks, 7 is heaven, 8's a gate, 9 is swine, and 10 is hen. So what you would do if you wanted to use peg words is you would remember these 10 phrases. Then, let's say you needed to remember a grocery list. You would associate each item in your grocery list with one of these items in your peg words. So for example, if the first item in your grocery list was peanut butter, you would remember 1 is a bun, and in order to associate bun with peanut butter, you would think about smearing peanut butter all over this hamburger bun where the peanut butter is dripping out of the bun. So the first item in your list, bun, you would remember peanut butter. And let's say the second item in your list is milk. So you would think, okay, 2's a shoe, and I want to somehow associate milk with a shoe. So you would imagine stepping into your shoes in the morning as you're getting ready to come to school, and as you put your foot inside, your sock gets soaked with milk. So you associate 2 with a shoe, and your shoe is filled with milk. And you would just continue down your list here, thinking of things that you can associate with each of these peg words. We'll be using peg words later on to remember things in some of the other chapters that we'll be looking at throughout the year. This is one type of mnemonic that you've probably used before. It's used quite often, and that's the first letter technique. And this technique is especially useful when the order of the items is important. So what you do is take the first letter of each word that you're trying to remember in this phrase and form a new word or a sentence. So for example here, you've probably had to at some point memorize the directions. So north, east, south, and west. And the way I remembered it was never eat shredded wheat, with of course the N in never meaning north, the E in east meaning eat meaning east, the S in shredded for south, and the W in wheat for west. Another example of the first letter technique here to remember the colors of the rainbow is Roy G. Biv. So you know it's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Substitution technique. This is I see a lot of times with advertising and businesses where letters are used to replace numbers. A lot of times it's used with phone numbers where businesses want you to remember their phone number, and it's easier for us to remember whole words rather than individual numbers on the keypad. So one I always remember is that lovely radio commercial about 1-800-GET-THIN. So because the Get Thin stands for the numbers on your keypad, it's much easier for us to remember this phrase as opposed to individual numbers. The keyword method. This is a method that we'll use in particular when we're learning the different parts of the brain. And for this, you think of a word that sounds like all or part of the word to remember. Then you're going to create a scenario involving that associated word and the definition of the word to be. So it sounds a little confusing, but let me show you an example here. So over here, all of these terms, as I'm scrolling down, these are all different parts of the brain that you'll need to, at one point, remember. This will be the next chapter that we go to. So let's give you an example. Up here we have Broca's area. Broca's area is an area of your brain that directs the muscles for speech production. So there's a couple different ways that you can look at keywords. One way to think of it is Broca kind of sounds like broken, which would be our keyword. Then we're going to associate this keyword with a mental picture. So the mental picture here is imagine breaking a talking doll. If it gets broken, referring to Broca's area, it won't talk anymore, which means that you won't be able to speak. Another way to remember Broca's area is the keyword might be boca, so mouth in Spanish, and I think of mouth in order to speak, so I associate that word boca with Broca's area. Loci is another method of visual encoding. So this is a mnemonic technique that relies on spatial relationships to establish order and recollect. If you remember on the brain games where the memory champion talked about placing items that he was trying to remember on the furniture in his house, this is an example of using loci. So in class I'm going to walk you through a story to help you to remember this grocery list, so I don't want to spend too much time on here. And this brings us to chunking. This is probably something that you've also done when you're trying to remember large sets of numbers. So this is organizing items into more familiar but manageable units. And a lot of times we do this automatically, especially we're trying to remember a list of numbers. So imagine if someone just read off numbers to you, the 7, 6, 0, 2, 4, 4, 2, 2, 8, 3. If you tried to remember those numbers individually, it might be a little bit more difficult. But when you chunk it into smaller parts, you'll notice it's just a phone number, which is very easy for us to remember. We remember it instead of this long string of numbers like it is up here, we group them together. So we know 760, 244, 2283, which is the number to Oak Hills High School. Another example here is you have this long list of numbers, which if you were just to read them off looks like a random set of numbers. But upon closer examination, we can see that if we break them into chunks here, they're much more manageable and easier for us to remember. And hopefully most of you have figured out these are all the dates of when U.S. wars have started. So War of Independence, War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. And in class we will do this activity where we're going to test how much information can you really process and remember at any one time. That concludes the rest of our encoding notes. Please don't forget to go back through, talk about the notes, don't just take it and never look at it again. That's not the way to encode and ensure that that information moves from your short-term or working memory into your long-term memory.